Oslo process was, in essence, a device to barter some of Israel's power in exchange for acceptance.
I think what we did was miracles.
The reason the peace process is totally stalemated today, and maybe even going in reverse, is the unfortunate assassination of Yitzhak Rabin.
And it is a test case for conflict resolution.
The moment they signed the Oslo Agreement, they signed up for two things. They signed up for a declaration of an Arab state, and I think they signed up for a war.
We are going to receive, in the near future, a police state.
I think the Oslo process had made war more likely.
If we shall not be able to maintain our deterrence, there will be war.
This is a war which neither side could win and both sides could lose.
It can be the end of the people of Israel.
At the end of what was supposed to be 5 years of peace talks to resolve the issues dividing Israelis and Palestinians, the rumblings of a renewed conflict are growing uncomfortably loud. The peace process, spawned in Oslo in the summer of 1993, lives on, but precariously. The paradox is this: the earnest efforts to make peace may have inadvertently laid the foundations for a new war. The question remains, can two peoples, each claiming the same strip of land, ever live together in peace? Many remarkable international meetings have taken place at the White House here in Washington, but few have carried the same sense of historical drama as the signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principles in September 1993. After it was over, Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, with a bit of reluctance, shook hands in public with Israel's former arch-foe, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat. That handshake appeared to usher in a new era of hope for peace in a region too long shadowed by the clouds of war. In this next hour, we're going to show you not only how those hopes began to fade, but how they may have turned into the seeds of a new conflict. Even Ehud Barak's stunning victory in Israel's elections of May 1999, in the views of some observers, may be unable to forestall such a conflict. The first signs of trouble with the Oslo peace process were visible almost immediately after the White House signing.
This is the first time in the modern history that a state recognized a terror organization and gave it a territory, money, ammunition, and guns.
I think Oslo is the worst tragedy that happened to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And in a certain aspect, it's worse because it was done by the Jews themselves. It wasn't done to them.
My shock was that the agreement was initial without it being looked at very carefully. The Declaration of Principles was initial, and that we had no room to study, amend, rectify, and deal with some of the built-in flaws.
We are in big prisons, economic inflation, high rate of unemployment, attacks on human rights is increasing. So what did Oslo bring us?
Unfortunately, the Oslo Agreement didn't mention even one article by promoting or protecting the rights of the Palestinian people, which means today that the Palestinians' rights becomes between the Israeli hammer and the Palestinian Authority anvil. We are suffering from the both sides, and such kind of violations making the people more and more hopeless.
So far, Oslo did not give me the hope which I was looking for.
Why not?
Why not? Because it did the contrary to what we wanted. It left the most important items on the agenda unsolved.
Was that a good decision in the beginning?
They should have tackled the important and difficult subjects before they come to what they are talking about now. And mind you, I am a man who believed in the United Nations. I believed in the resolutions of the Council, I believe that there were resolutions that I was depending on. 194, 181, 191, the partition, the 224, 238. Where are these resolutions? We start now from scratch.
Arafat thought that the Israelis are negotiating with him the way they negotiated with Sadat. The Palestinians came to these negotiations as if they were internationally recognized and bilaterally with Israel recognized as a sovereign independent state like Egypt or Lebanon or Syria. Arafat thought that he is just like Sadat or Assad or any prime minister in Lebanon, and he is not in the eyes of the Israelis.
On the Palestinian side, 6 of the 18 PLO Executive Committee members resigned in protest against what Yasser Arafat had committed the PLO to do. Several prominent West Bankers complained to him in writing that the PLO had failed to take into account the views of West Bankers and Gazans in putting together the Oslo documents.
The Oslo process was, in essence, a device to barter some of Israel's power in exchange for acceptance. And in essence, what Israel has done is barter the one thing that forced acceptance of its existence on the other side for something that was ephemeral. And now it has neither, or it still has power, but it has less of the power, less of the respect, and it really hasn't negotiated or bartered it for something solid. At the heart of it, the issue was whether Israel's a legitimate country. And the debate over the West Bank was not whether the Palestinians are a nation or whether they have inalienable sovereign rights to the territories. What it was whether or not the territories as a whole belonged to Israel or to the Palestinians. The Israelis looked at it as a pragmatic decision. It's a demographic nightmare. We'll give it up. We won't continue to rule the Palestinians. What the Palestinians understood was when Hebron is given up, when Bethlehem is given up, the Israelis are beginning to admit that they had stolen land. And they had established a principle that if Hebron is their land, then really what differentiates it from the territories of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Haifa, and so forth. A 1948 demarcation line is just a ceasefire. It doesn't answer the question as to whether or not the territory really belongs to one side or another. So they had secured in the Oslo process a very significant concession from Israel, which is that the legitimate rights of the Palestinians are on par with the legitimate rights of Israel. Right there, you begin to undermine the idea of a nation.
As a counterweight to the strong criticism of Oslo, there were early signs of encouragement that the process was working. In Cairo, on May 4, 1994, Arafat and Rabin signed the Gaza-Jericho Agreement on the terms of Israel's early withdrawal from these areas. The United States organized a major economic conference in Washington to channel new funding into the Palestinian Authority. Israelis were further heartened 1 year after Oslo when Jordan's King Hussein, Israel's closest Arab neighbor, signed a peace treaty with Israel.
I think what we did was miracles. Two parties that distrust each other, that hated each other, that couldn't look at each other. In 5 short years, to bring them over, from violence to peace, from rejection to negotiation, from hopelessness to hope, from problems to partners, is a great achievement.
Despite what a lot of people think, the Oslo Accords, as the Declaration of Principles is sometimes called, is not a peace treaty at all. It is really just a statement of intent to negotiate what it calls a just, lasting and comprehensive peace settlement and historic reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. The 12-page document included a letter by Arafat recognizing Israel's right to exist and one by Rabin recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. It committed Israel to withdrawing early on from Gaza and Jericho, and the Palestinians to establishing an interim political body called the Palestinian Authority. Israel agreed to transfer civic powers to the Palestinians and the Palestinians agreed to organize elections in their areas. Finally, the two sides said that they would discuss the permanent status issues like Jerusalem, refugees and borders during a transition period that shouldn't last longer than 5 years. Though most Palestinians and Israelis welcomed the Oslo Accords, minorities of each community were bitterly opposed to them. Some Israeli families are deeply divided about how Israelis should relate to Palestinians. Nachum Bedin served in the Israeli reserves guarding Palestinian prisoners.
What I saw, say, in the early 90s during the Intifada was the treatment of the Arabs by the Israelis to a great degree of just completely mistrust. And maybe looking for one man, so they would bring in 50. And they would bring in short and tall, and they wouldn't care about the age. It just would bring in 50 men, as opposed to anyone from the age of 10 to 50. So I saw 10-year-olds being taken in, and I saw 50-year-olds being taken in and treated in the same way.
Most Arabs are potential killers.
You say most Arabs are potential killers?
You can't know who is and who isn't. So you should check on.
We have no contact in our day-to-day lives with Palestinians. Nachum does at work, but I certainly don't.
What's the reason for that?
Because we don't have a common interest, I guess. I don't know. We live in an area where it's a Jewish area. We don't live. The areas are separate. I wouldn't want to, but I couldn't just go and live in an Arab village.
Would you want to have Arab friends? Would it be interesting to you?
I don't think I would want to.
We're willing to live as neighbors, put it this way. So hopefully we will not. Right now, I have an American passport. I can go through Jerusalem. But my neighbors, my friends, they can't even go pray in Jerusalem because you need a special permit to cross borders. This is not the way we expect to have a Palestine. This is not the way we expect to live side by side with the Israelis. We want open borders. We want the rights, just like the Israelis have rights.
This barren strip of land, hugging the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, has drawn the world's conquerors and captured the hearts of its poets and prophets since the beginning of recorded history. Depending on who you're talking to, this is Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land. And understanding its history is essential if one is to unravel what is at the heart of the present-day Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many people are familiar with the biblical accounts of the rise and fall of the Kingdom of Israel. By the time of Christ, Israel was occupied by the Romans, and after one rebellion too many, in 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian had the Jews expelled from Jerusalem. Even so, they continued to live here in small numbers, though from the 7th century onwards, Palestine was overwhelmingly occupied by Arabs. But in the 1880s, two dramatic developments in Europe changed all this. Was an outbreak of anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia and Ukraine. Thousands of Jews were persecuted. The second was the emergence of a new movement called Zionism, calling for Jews to return to their ancient biblical homeland and create a new Jewish state. From Russia and Eastern Europe, Jews began to immigrate to Palestine in a steady stream. But the brilliance of a young Austrian Jew named Theodor Herzl was about to turn that stream into a river. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. His objective? Establish a Jewish national state that would be a haven for Jews from persecution anywhere in the world. In November 1917, Herzl's dream got a boost from the British government in the form of a policy statement authored by the then British Foreign Secretary, Sir Arthur Balfour. The so-called Balfour Declaration asserted that the British government would favour what it called the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. December 11th, 1917, British troops under General Allenby entered Jerusalem to drive out the Jews. They had been there exactly 400 years. The British now began a troubled 30 years of their own control of Palestine. In 1922, the League of Nations made British rule official, describing it as the British Mandate. By now, there were some 84,000 Jews here, barely 11% of the total population of some 765,000. But the rivalries and prejudices between these two Semitic groups had not lessened with time. The arrival of Jewish immigrants only fueled the animosities between them, as Arab communities resisted the outsiders with their foreign religion and culture. Throughout the 1920s, Jewish immigration continued, sparking further outbreaks of hostility between Arabs and Jews. In 1936, the Arabs revolted, and the British government responded by restricting future Jewish immigration. 3 years later, the madness of anarchy began to become the world. The Jewish Holocaust of World War II would ultimately give the Zionists their dream. When the war ended in 1945, surviving Jews from across Europe turned to Palestine, believing, or at least hoping, that here at last their lives would finally be safe. Palestine now became a nightmare for the British, who still had 100,000 soldiers here, easy targets for the underground Jewish groups who were intent on driving the British from their new home. In 1947, the British, exhausted by the war and the burdens of a crumbling empire, finally gave up, handing Palestine over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed to partition Palestine into 3 areas: Arab, Jewish, and an international zone around Jerusalem. The plan was accepted by the 560,000 Jews living in Palestine, but angrily rejected by its 1.2 million Arab refugees. Brutal hostilities immediately erupted between the two communities. Atrocities were committed by both sides. The Jews took matters into their own hands, declaring themselves an independent state on May 14, 1948. But there was little time to celebrate. The next day, Israel was invaded by the armies of Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iran. To everyone's surprise, including the Jews, Israel managed to hold its own, pushing the invading Arab armies back to an armistice line that would be later defined as Israel's international border. 6,000 Jews and many more Arabs died in this war. For Palestinians, 1948 became known as the Year of El Nakba, the catastrophe, because 700,000 of them fled their homes in Palestine to escape the fighting. Encouragement by some Arab governments had contributed to this panic flight, but so did the actions of Jewish army units in many Palestinian villages. More wars took place in 1956 and 1967 between Israel and its Arab neighbors, with 1967 marking a new milestone in the conflict. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were defeated in that year. Israel found itself in control of more than 1 million Palestinian Arabs living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That part of Jordan that the Hashemite monarchy had annexed from Palestine in 1950. Arabs in Israel proper had the right of citizenship, but for those Palestinians swept up under Jewish control in Gaza and the West Bank, life was now a daily experience of military occupation. War returned in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel in October. Though his forces were eventually turned back, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat felt confident enough in 1977 to visit Jerusalem, and in 1979 to sign a peace treaty with his former enemy. He paid a price for his courage, getting assassinated by Islamic radicals in October 1981, 8 years to the day after launching the surprise attack. Palestinians hoped to gain something from the Israeli-Egyptian peace, but they were disappointed. Desperate, they rose up against Israeli rule in 1987 in a revolt of stone-throwing and strikes they called the Intifada, or shaking off. Hundreds of protesters were killed, and many Israelis died too. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the spectacle of some Palestinians cheering on Iraqi Scud missile attacks on Israel shocked many people already numbed by the agonizing conflict. These are the images of a century of hopes fulfilled, hatreds unleashed, and ceaseless warfare. Could this cycle ever be broken?
The Islamic radical group Hamas never relented in its desire to eliminate Israel altogether. On the Israeli side, a fanatical settler, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, killed 29 Palestinians in a shooting rampage in Hebron in February 1994. Seriously unsettling. When the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the 1994 Peace Prize to Rabin, Peres and Arafat for their completion of the Declaration of Principles, many saw the accolade as a recognition of a major moral act, but not everyone. In an act without precedent in the normally secretive Nobel Committee, former Norwegian Member of Parliament and Government Minister Kåre Christensen refused to be part of any process that would reward Yasser Arafat.
I resigned because that was a cause of principle for me. I couldn't accept that a man that most of his life, for 30 years, had it as his aim to kill and murder civilians, innocent people that had done nothing wrong, that he should be awarded the world's most outstanding peace prize. I couldn't accept. We all knew him, and there was no doubt in the committee what he had done.
Back in Israel, there were far darker clouds on the horizon as extremists kept up a drumbeat of opposition to Prime Minister Rabin, accusing him of having committed treason against Israel by agreeing to the Oslo Accords. On November 4, 1995, in a searing blur of shouting and shooting, Rabin was killed by an Israeli assassin's bullet after leading a rally in Tel Aviv. Anger at the peace process proclaimed its first truly high-level victory.
The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was a terrible trauma for Israelis. It was the first political murder of the nation's leader in Israel's modern history. But even worse, the terrible act revealed how bitterly divided Israelis had become and the implications of Oslo for their nation's future.
I think the reason Oslo slowed down and the reason the peace process is totally stalemated today and maybe even going in reverse is the unfortunate assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a fellow Jew. I think that's just one of the most tragic things that has happened to the cause of peace worldwide that I can think of. We were making really good progress, and of course, with his assassination, that government was not able to maintain its position of power, and you had a hardline Likud government come to power that was not willing to lean forward for peace the way that Labor government had been leaning.
Israelis were so horrified at the fruit of extremist political rhetoric in their own midst that the first reactions to the Rabin killing were strongly pro-Oslo. But after Palestinian Hamas suicide bombers early in 1996 killed 63 Israelis in the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Ashkelon, Israeli voters swung over to Likud opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu, whose political campaign slogan, "Peace with Security," helped winning the prime ministership in May 1996. Netanyahu said he would honor the Israeli-Palestinian agreements signed by his predecessors, but would be much tougher than they had been on Palestinian compliance.
I said in 1996, when I was indeed running and critical of the Oslo Accords, that notwithstanding my criticism, I would keep the Accords, because that's what orderly democratic governments do. You honor those international commitments undertaken by your predecessors. And indeed, that's exactly what I did. But I also said that I would ask and demand that the Palestinians also honor the Accords, and that has made a difference. It has reduced considerably the threat of terrorism. You couldn't walk on the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv 3 years ago because, in fact, the Palestinians were doing nothing to control the Hamas terrorists. They're still very far from what they should be doing, but they're doing more than they did because we've introduced the idea of reciprocity. You give, you receive. You don't give, you don't receive, which is how contracts, any contract, should be implemented. And the second thing, I think, is that we have negotiated, I think, successfully in Y to leave Israel with sufficient margins of defense. It's a tiny country, Israel. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. And it must have territorial buffers, which I may say happen to be completely uninhabited by Palestinians, but which are replete with historical meaning for us, and more to the point, they are full of, I would say, of consequences for our present and future security. So I think it's possible to work these accords to a successful end, giving Israel security, giving the Palestinians a way to govern their own lives.
6 years after that historic signing in Washington, peace seems even further beyond the horizon than before Oslo. Many are now convinced that the peace process itself could be helping to fuel the potential for a renewed conflict or even a war.
One of the most tragic things we learned during our reporting was the extent of human rights abuses by the security organs of the Palestinian Authority. A handful of courageous people spoke to us openly about them, but many others were too frightened to face our cameras. Do you think there have been human rights abuses within the Palestinian Authority?
Oh, yes.
What kind?
It's one of them dealing with the rule of law and due process. In terms of human rights violations, detention without cause, without evidence, without due process, not presenting people before a civil court. The establishment, again, of what is called the State Security Court as a military court, presenting civilian cases before that. We had called for the dismantlement of the State Security Court. Other things having to do with political rights, respect for political pluralism. People are being arrested. We have political detention, which is entirely unacceptable.
This is still continuing despite protests.
It is continuing. We have taken very, very strong positions.
You were the editor of An-Nahar newspaper from 1986 to 1996.
That's right.
What happened to the paper?
Well, actually, it's a paper of opposition, and many people in the PA don't like opposition.
So how did they stop it publishing?
I stopped publishing because there was too much pressure.
Too much pressure?
Yeah.
What sort of pressure was being brought to bear?
Pressure in what to publish, what not to publish, what was taboo, what was... I mean, it was far from being a free press. The PA came with their own newspapers, with their own journalists, with their own media. So they didn't want any opposition. They were opposed to any opposition.
So is there freedom of the press in the Palestinian Authority right now?
No. There is nothing.
What would be needed to guarantee freedom of the press?
Well, democracy,
right.
Liberty, the right to speak.
Do Palestinians have the right to speak?
We have a long way to go.
Mr. Bassem Eid,
Thank
you are the General Director of the Palestine Human Rights Monitoring Group here in Jerusalem.
That's right.
What sort of things have gone wrong with human rights since Oslo?
As an example, in the Palestinian Authority, the torture becomes widespread. It's practiced by the all Palestinian security forces. It's including the all prisoners, never mind if they are political prisoners or they are people who committed any kind of crimes or any civilian offenses.
How many Palestinian security services are there?
Really, we don't know exactly. Some people said that they are 9. The Europeans said that they are 11, which I believe the Europeans, because the Europeans who are paying the salaries of all of these security forces.
And the Europeans are not concerned about human rights violations?
Unfortunately not, because the Europeans and mostly the Scandinavians, the most important thing for them, how to push the peace process forward. Human rights, this is something which is not so urgent for them. The most urgent thing is how to create the Palestinian state, and then the Palestinians themselves who is going to deal with the violations of human rights.
Do you feel that human rights are an obstacle to the peace process in the minds of European negotiators?
See, what I believe that without respecting the rights of the people, you will never be able to create any justice peace.
You had suggested that on college campuses, some professors are concerned about their future and therefore don't want to upset the security services.
Yeah, I remember in July 97, the Preventive Security Force in Gaza arrested a professor, Fathi Subuh, from Al-Azhar University. And 2 months later, I wrote a petition requiring President Arafat to forgive the professor who was arrested because one of his questions to his students, what do you think about the Palestinian Authority corruption? This is the offense that he committed, or the crime that he committed. If we have so many security forces, if we have so many violations of human rights by these security forces, so it seems to me today that without a kind of struggle from the society itself against these violations, we are going to receive in the near future a police state.
There are approximately 400 Hamas members, affiliates in Palestinian jails. And some of these persons have been in jail for almost a year and a half, some 3 years, and they have not been taken to court until now.
One footnote to this interview. When it was over, Sheikh Hassan Yusuf told us that he fully expected to be imprisoned for criticizing the Palestinian Authority on camera. He had previously spent more than 6 months in jail for doing just this.
From Palestinians and Israelis, we kept hearing complaints about corruption within the newly established Palestinian Authority. Disturbingly, the money trail appeared to go to the very top of the authority itself.
We had, in the Palestine Legislative Council, we had asked for reform, thorough, pervasive, comprehensive reform.
Why?
Because of the reports, whether it's the audit report, whether it's the Legislative Council's report, or whether it is the Cabinet report on corruption, mismanagement, abuse or misuse of funds or public office. So we were promised a full reform, and I had looked forward to being part of the process of rectification. Unfortunately, we ended up with maintaining all the old people and the existing structures and adding 10 more ministers. And I told President Arafat, if the problem was the lack of ministers, we could have solved this a long time ago. But if we do not exercise accountability, and if we do not show respect for the rule of law,
right,
and if we do not show respect for the people and their representatives in the form of the Legislative Council by responding to people's needs and to people's calls for reform, then certainly we have no business being in positions of authority.
Without democratization of the Palestinian community, you will never have a stable peace process or a stable peace arrangements.
Does Chairman Arafat understand, in your view, the dimensions of the challenges for democracy?
It's very difficult for him. I mean, he has led a revolutionary movement for a long, long time. And it is absolutely difficult for him to understand the necessity to change from ways and methods of ruling a revolutionary movement into ruling a state.
According to the Paris Protocol that was signed between the Israeli state and the Palestinian Authority in 1994, Israel have to repay the Palestinian Authority the money it collects from goods that are being imported through Israeli airports and seaports to Palestine, to Palestinian Authority. After signing the peace or the Paris Protocol, Israel asked the Palestinian financial executives where should we put the money in? And they gave Israel a few bank accounts, 2 of them in Gaza that are registered on the name of the Palestinian Authority. But most of the money, all the money that is being collected from taxation on oil and petroleum, is being deposited from Israel to a secret bank account that is registered on the Arafat's name, his personal bank accounts, in Leumi Bank in Hashmonaim Street in Tel Aviv.
Now, was this report that your newspaper carried denied by the Palestinian Authority or by Arafat?
Mohammed Rashid told me that the money is being transferred from he admitted that there is a secret bank account in Tel Aviv. He did not deny it. But he told me that that this is just a transit station. And the money is going from Tel Aviv to the official bank accounts of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. When I asked other officials, high-rank officials in the Palestinian Authority, they told me that the money is not coming there. And we also published a secret report that was done by officials within the United States government saying that the money is not being transferred from Tel Aviv to Gaza, but is disappearing in the way, staying in Tel Aviv or being transferred to Switzerland, I don't know where.
How much money is involved in this account?
$500 million shekels, which was then $150 million, was deposited by Israel to this secret bank accounts, which is a lot of money.
Why does Yasser Arafat need a secret account?
Say that it's not for personal corruption. I think that we can mark at least 3 main goals for having so much money. The first one is in order to build a government in exile in case of need, in case of coup. He will be able to flee Palestine with all his people, with his guards, with his wife, with his family, with his belongings, and build another establishment outside of Palestine. The second purpose is to pay the salary of the vast establishment of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority have tripled the number of government employees from the era of the Israeli rulement upon Palestine, meaning Israel had something like 10,000 people that are being paid by the government. Now they have 30,000. They don't need so much. But Arafat believes that by paying people, keeping people on the payroll of the Palestinian Authority, it does inflect, or it does stronger his rulement and his leadership.
It strengthens his rule,
yeah.
right.
Mm-hmm. And the third purpose is to continue the payment of salaries to orphans and widows that is being continued from the time that he was in exile.
The Palestinians know that much of the money goes to the pockets of these people.
Have you received documentation about this?
Yes, I have. My institute received documentations that point to the fact that, for example, if we just take one small example, about $20 million disappeared from the Palestinian pension fund in Gaza alone. That money clearly going to the pockets of people in and around the PA administration.
Palestinians are not free to move about the city. This is their own city. They can't walk up the street sometimes. Vehicular traffic has to be rerouted to other areas. Until you address this issue, you won't see real communication between 2 groups of people. Unless there is direct international intervention in this, I predict, unfortunately, that this will permanently force segregation for the Palestinian people. If nothing is done about this situation, Palestinians are going to be forced off the land outside of their cities. They're going to be forced into the cities. The Israeli settlements are going to become permanent. The bypass roads are going to cut off Palestinians from seeing each other in different areas of the West Bank. And it's just going to legitimize the military occupation that's been here since 1967.
Do you anticipate a renewal of conflict?
Yeah, I do.
You don't have to be Jewish to support our existence and presence here, because Hebron is the chance to live in peace. In Hebron, Jews have been living almost 4,000 years, many thousands of years before the Arabs came into this country. There was a Jewish community here. We live only in houses that were built or purchased by Jews more than 100 or 200 years ago. As you know, the Jewish community of Hebron was massacred and exiled by the Arabs. I think no sane man can demand us to withdraw to the terror, to give up to the terror, and to let the fundamentalist Islamic terror take over just because we want to kill Jews.
I think that the settlement is a bone of contention. It is a source of instability, and I think that we should strive to ask these people to go back to a land which is fully sovereign by the State of Israel.
The test of the will for peace is in the way you bring up your children, because perhaps the present generation, the older generation, may be so contaminated with hatred and hostility and antagonism and bitterness. It's possible that it may be incurable. But if you don't educate the younger generation to feel differently about each other, there's no hope.
The textbooks are Jordanian from 20 years ago, and they didn't have time to modify them. So I brought some Israeli specialists, and we said, how long will it take to erase all the anti-Israeli propaganda from the textbooks from the first grade to the umpteenth grade? And they said 9 months. So I said, well, we are ready to cooperate with you to do the erasing, and here are the Americans, they will be happy to pay the bill. so the American ambassador was not very happy, but he agreed. Of course not. And other pretexts come along because they don't want to change it.
Incitement still takes place on all levels in school. In schools, school children are taught to hate and engage in violence when they grow up against Israel. Palestinian TV broadcasts a lot of calls for incitement. Their newspapers are still filled with incitement and hatred toward Israel. The transition on a societal level was, I don't think, made.
If settlements continue to expand, and if Palestinians continue increasingly feel that they live in something that is like an apartheid system, with very serious discrimination against their rights, with great difficulties in passing from one place to the other, I think the resistance will grow.
We are not building new settlements. Not a single new settlement has been built in the past 8 years. What we're doing is building inside the settlement, inside these villages and towns, within their municipal borders, to accommodate the natural growth which occurs as a result of births and of population movements.
We are not going to allow settlements per se to continue as an expression of Israeli extraterritoriality, as a system of apartheid. The settlements, I believe, as artificial imposed realities on Palestinian land should be dismantled. Now, dealing with people is another issue. Yes, will not give the settlements any legality.
Even the ones around Jerusalem?
Of course.
It's not the settlements that's making the problem. It's the existence of Jewish sovereignty in an area of the world that the Arabs consider their own.
The idea that the Israelis can continue to change the situation on the ground while supposedly negotiating in good faith and before final status negotiations can continue is outrageous.
We deal with 3.6 million refugees who live in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank.
The right of return is one of the United Nations resolutions, and refugees is one of the permanent status issues to be discussed. What do the Palestinian refugees expect from talks about refugee rights?
Well, I suspect that expectations are very different. But one thing that the refugees will not come and say up front is that we are compromising on our right of return. This is something that is very basic to their perception of themselves as a people and response to their history. Undoubtedly, it will be the subject of a great deal of discussion, but certainly as somebody from the UN, I'm not the one who's going to enter into a discussion drawing this into question.
If it is continued like this without principles for the right of the return, more conscious and explosion I expect in the refugees.
You expect an explosion in the future?
In the refugee camps, that's right.
What kind of explosion?
You know, this explosion because they want their issue as a refugee issue to be on the top. If this issue did not solve, this means that any time after 10 years, after 20 years, this will come back and raise again. And one day it will explode.
There is a very great part of this society that believes that they will return to Jaffa and to Akko and to Ramle and to all the other parts of Israel today. And who is saying it is not the people of the street, but Mr. Arafat himself.
I care that my people who are all over the world should be given the chance to decide whether they want to come back or whether they want to accept a reparation, compensation. There is one thing that every Arab has to understand. To ask Israel to commit suicide by giving up the Jewish majority in Israel is simply unacceptable.
As you drive through the territories, you find a lot of roads that have been built by Israeli military engineers, and the Palestinians complain furiously that these roads are a way of breaking up the contiguity of Palestinian territory. How do you respond to that?
In a way, they're right. In a way, they're right, because the roads were built with a strategic, territorial, or rather topographical imperatives in mind. You see, this is the topographical point, which is pretty obvious. Like this, you have hundreds. So they are not all in one place. It's not a question where you can cut in two and say, I make some sort of a justice. If a Palestinian state emerges, it will have to live with all kinds of strategic, of Israel's strategic position interspersed in its areas. So you have to reach it. Now, from my experience running convoys to Jerusalem in '48, it's not enough to have the road. You have to have the high ground protecting that road or covering that road. So it creates a hell of a problem.
They have built more than 24 new bypass roads which cut the West Bank into pieces.
They built those roads since the Oslo process began.
And with the Y plantation agreement, they will be building 22 more roads.
If the Israelis continue to refuse the two-state solution presented by the extremist positions of Netanyahu's government, then certainly the only option becomes the one-state solution, which ultimately would lead to the negation of Israel as a Zionist state for all Jews and would become either a binational state or an open democratic state for all its citizens.
A binational state, which will be by uniting all the people under the same framework, which will mean an ongoing war, eternally, without a solution. The two people will fight endlessly for every drop of water, for every piece of land, for every expression of authority. They will maintain hatred and suspicion. We should be crazy to do it.
There is a very clear unbalance between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and accordingly it seems like the negotiations are one-sided and the Israelis are constantly imposing on the Palestinian Authority its position as well as point of view.
But in the long run, the Sheikh would be happier if Israel did not exist as a state.
Only when a Palestinian state is established and we have our rights, then we can talk about this.
With the election of Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Barak, many Palestinians feel that there is at least a chance for serious negotiations to resume in the quest for Palestinian statehood. As one Palestinian leader put it, It is better to deal with a tough negotiator than a non-negotiator.
But what do you think Mr. Netanyahu came to power? He tried in the beginning to change the concept of the agreement. And he tried to change the principle of the agreement. And he tried to renegotiate all the issues of the agreement. And if you remember, he renegotiated Hebron. Hebron in the agreement, it was very clear. He had nothing, but he spent 6 months negotiating for Hebron. Other than that, nothing is being achieved.
I think that Netanyahu has a point when he says that he was not the one responsible for the destruction of Oslo, but the crisis of Oslo brought him to power.
Well, I think at least one can date the beginning of the process. And that was with the new government, well, which is no longer new government, but with the change of government in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu had said for 3 years that he believed the Oslo process to be a very dangerous one. It's a process he does not like.
We own most of Palestine. We own most of Israel. Now, if we want to go back to that, it means that we will end up taking most of Israel. Because legally, it is whether private or collective property belongs to the Palestinians. However, Israel was established on Palestinian land. That's why we're giving them a way out by saying we will accept the 1967 boundaries.
They have the right to insist on whatever they want, but a peace is a compromise and not a response to one-sided demand. We have also some demands. We understand that in war, there is no alternative to victory. In peace, there is no alternative to compromise.
Jerusalem of today is not Jerusalem of 1967. Metropolitan Jerusalem is far larger. And the Palestinians and everybody accept that Jerusalem today is a far more amorphous sort of space than it used to be in 1967. I think that within that big new metropolitan Jerusalem, some kind of presence, which is of a political nature, will have to be given to the Palestinians.
Not one stone, not even one stone of Jerusalem is negotiable. It's been the spiritual center of Jews from the beginning of Jews.
The Muslims would not accept any compromise for Jerusalem. Jerusalem for a Muslim is a unified, pure Muslim city.
What would you like to see happen to Jerusalem?
Stay out.
Stay Israeli all the way through?
Yes.
Would the Arabs have any political rights in their part of the city?
I hope not.
Jerusalem has only been the capital of the Jewish people. It never served as a capital for any other nation.
Jerusalem belongs to 1.5 billion Muslims.
Prime Minister Barak's Labour Party has worked long and hard to try to resolve the Jerusalem issue. Within days of Barak's election, some Israelis were speaking of the possibility of a new breakthrough in determining the city's future. But as one Palestinian told me, it may take years to resolve the city's final status. What starts a new war? No one knows for sure, but any one of these troublesome issues could become the deadly ingredient of a renewed conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The problem is this: the Oslo peace formula deferred the really hard issues to the very end of the process, ensuring that the final combination of them could prove lethal for peace.
These voices carry deeply disturbing messages for the cause of Israeli-Palestinian peace in the wake of the Oslo process. Yet despite them, we continue to find, like wildflowers growing in a bed of concrete, voices not just of hope, but of deep compassion and even of love amidst the swirling conflict.
You can only be truly faithful and you can only truly sanctify God's name if you demonstrate that religion can be a force for peace, for dignity, for respect, for tranquility between people.
I think there is a solution. I don't think it's a human solution. And we can fight and argue all we want. We can say all we want. I guess I only hope that we'll learn to love one another. When we love one another, Jew with Jew,
Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, whatever that means, then it'll work. And I really think the Almighty has the answer for what's going to happen. I haven't got any answer. I just want to make sure in my daily life that I treat everybody equally and with respect.
Now it's high time to restore confidence, and faith, and love, and remove all those roots of hatred from the hearts of both sides. Love each other. Love each other. If you are real, noble believers in God, you have to wash your hearts from anything that God resents and forbids. On the top of the list is hatred.
To reconcile together, to fall in each other's arms. In Arabic, the name is musalaha. It means reconciliation. The two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, will come together. If I didn't believe that, I would have run away from here long ago.
What is it about this land? Why is its history so drenched in warfare? It has failed to demonstrate any reservoirs of oil or glistening treasures of minerals. It has few natural beauties to entice the heart. Yet its inhabitants and its would-be inhabitants throughout history have looked upon its soil as the apple of their eye. It is clear that Israelis and Palestinians of goodwill have a deep desire for peace. They talk about it, they yearn for it, yet it eludes them. A real honesty is needed in facing the hard issues. One thing is certain. On the ground, where Israelis and Palestinians must face each other, a peace will never come without lasting reconciliation. Those who have died in this wrenching conflict and the weary who live on deserve no less.